Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar. Today, we have with us Odette Scharenborg. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that our center, the Language Technology Center, organizes. We have already had two before in November and December. This is the webinar for January, and then we will have 4 more webinars, or 5 perhaps, one each month this year. My name is Ima Hernández, and I am just a member of the board of each research center. And today is my pleasure to introduce Odette Scharenborg. She is an associate professor in Delft Technology University, and she's also a Delft Technology Fellow in the Multimedia Group in the university in the Netherlands. She has an interdisciplinary background in speech processing and in psycholinguistics. And what I find very interesting in your research, Odette, is that it is focused on speech processing, automatic speech processing, but inspired by human speech processing. So the aim of this being inspired by human speech processing is to develop inclusive speech technology. So speech technology that works for everybody, irrespective of the origin or how they speak or the language they speak, etc. Odette is particularly interested in non-nativeness, low-resource languages, and atypical or disordered speech, emotions, and most of all, combinations of this kind of speech. And she uses, this is also very interesting, different techniques. So to develop the research, so ranging from human listeners experiments, but also eye tracking, EEG, and also, of course, computational modeling and deep neural networks. She's involved in the International Speech Communication Association, ISCA. So she's in the board since 2019. And there in this association, she's also chair of the diversity committee. She's member of the IEEE Speech and Language Processing Technical Committee since 2018. And she's also senior editor of the IEEE Signal Processing Letters. She has more than 100 international publications. And I give you the floor now. I pass you the floor, Odette. So we are looking forward to your interesting seminar.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the very nice introduction. I still can't share my screen, so I'll wait for the button to light up. And yeah, so today, there is the share button. See that one? Now I have to move you back here so I can actually see people. Okay, so can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, today I'm actually going to talk about my research on the border of something is making a lot of noise here on my side. Yeah, it's fine now. On the intersection of psycholinguistics and automatic speech recognition. And the title of my talk is Speech Representations and Processing in Deep Neural Networks. I don't know, sorry, something really weird is happening on my side. But there's a lot of beeping. Can you hear the beeping or not? Okay, so something is okay. This is okay. So we'll see. So yes, sorry about that. I've never had this before, so I have no idea what's going wrong. But anyway, oh, I know. Yes, I can see what's happening here. It's my setup. Hopefully this will help. Okay, so the ultimate goal of my research is to build inclusive automatic speech recognition, or ASR for short, and that is ASR for everyone. So irrespective of how one speaks, or what kind of voice someone has, or what kind of accent someone has, or the age of a person, irrespective of what language they speak, I would like to develop ASR systems that can recognize the speech of that particular person. And there are many subfields within that larger aim, and I'm working on different aspects of that larger aim. But today we'll be mostly focusing on how we can build, or this is not specifically how we can build, but how I would like to build automatic speech recognition systems for all languages. So there are around, well, depending on how you count and depending on how you define a language, there are almost 7,000 languages in the world, but only for about 2% of these languages do we have automatic speech recognition systems that work reasonably well. So why only for these 2%? So why not for the other 98% of the world's languages? And that's because there's a problem, and that problem has to do with the way we have to train the automatic speech recognizers. So in order to train an automatic speech recognizer, you need to have speech materials, of course, and you need to have text data. But importantly, you also need to have the annotations of the speech data. So you need to know what has been said for at least a large chunk of the speech data that you have. And you need the text data in order to build the language model. Now, for many languages, we do not have enough of that material. For most languages, we have some speech data, some annotations. Typically, we do have a lot of textual data. Look, for instance, on all the information that you can find on the web for many languages in the world. But for many languages, we do not have enough annotated speech data. And then there are actually languages that do not have a written form. In these languages, they're actually spoken by millions and millions of people in the world. If there is no written form, then we cannot have a standard way of annotating the speech signal. So we cannot have a standard way of use a standard way to describe the content of the speech signal. And we don't have any textual resources to train the language models. So the problem that we're facing is that for many, many languages, we simply do not have enough data available to train the automatic speech recognizers. There are many ways of how you can deal with that. For instance, one of the ways of dealing with this problem is by recording more data, by developing a certain annotation scheme for languages that do not have a written form, etc. What I would like to do is, so my goal is to create a flexible ASR. So instead of trying to use standard approaches that people have been using for a long time, so you have your annotated speech data and you have the textual data, and you use that to train your ASR system. I would like to develop a flexible ASR that is trained on one language or one type of speech, and that can be mapped to another language or another type of speech. So if you look at it from a linguistic point of view, or a language point of view, this is a type of a cross-lingual ASR system. That's the area that I work in. But in order to create such a flexible ASR system, what we need are a bunch of things. So the first one is we need to have invariant units of speech. And these invariant units of speech should be able to transfer easily and accurately to new languages, to new languages and new types of speech. And for people who work in the area of cross-lingual ASR, you know how difficult it is to train an ASR system on one language and then use it on another language. And the reason is that even though we would have the same sounds according to the IPA system, the actual pronunciation of a particular sound is dependent on the language in which it is spoken. So even though we have, say, we share phonemes between different languages, the actual pronunciations are different. And that really hampers cross-lingual transfer of languages. So we are looking for these kind of speech units that actually do transfer easily and accurately to other languages. Then we need to have an ASR system that can flexibly adapt to new languages and types of speech. Then we need to have an ASR system that can decide when to create a new sound category. Because if you have one language and you have another language, there might be an overlap in the phonemes between the two languages, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a 100% overlap. And typically there's actually not a 100% overlap in phonemes between two languages. So if you go from one language to the other, you often need to create new acoustic models for these particular sounds. Here, my idea is to create ASR systems that can decide by themselves when to create such a new sound category. And once this decision is made, then the ASR system, of course, needs to be able to create it by itself. In this talk, I will be focusing on the first two parts. This is the research that I've been working on for the past few years. So I will be talking about these invariant units of speech. Do they exist? How can we find them? Can we find them? How can we find them? And can we build an ASR system that can flexibly adapt to new languages and types of speech? But when you think about it, these invariant units of speech and this flexible adaptation, we actually already have a speech recognition system that can do that. And that is the human listener. So we humans are able to adapt to basically all kinds of pronunciations and all types of speakers. And actually we can do that very, very fast. Also, we are able to learn new languages. And when we're learning new languages, we create new sound categories when learning this new language. So in order to build this flexible ASR system that can flexibly deal with different types of speech in different languages, I am looking at what we humans can do when we are processing speech, when we are learning a new language. But you might think, but okay, great. But how are we going to do that? Because, you know, humans are humans, ASR systems are computer systems. They simply have a very different type of hardware. So how can you compare one to the other? How can you use information back and forth? I will not go into details about that topic. I can, if you have any questions about that, I can discuss this. But what I would like to point out is that even though humans and machines have different hardware, if you look at it from a different level, then the task that both have, so that we have as human listeners and as machines, is to recognize the words in the speech signal. So the task that we're dealing with is the same for both humans and machines. And there is actually quite a bit of research showing that the comparison of human speech processing and automatic speech processing is actually beneficial. On the one hand, using techniques from ASR and computer science and more generally can help us in learning more about how humans process speech. And one area of research is computational modeling of human spoken word recognition, where we're using techniques from ASR to learn more about or building a model of how humans process speech. And the other way around as well. So if you look at, for instance, the acoustic features that are often used with automatic speech recognition systems, many of the acoustic features are actually inspired by the human ear and by human hearing. So for instance, the MFCCs, the PLPs, but also a few years ago, there was template-based ASR systems, and those are based on episodic theories of human spoken word recognition. So there is actually quite a bit of research out there showing that if you look at, if you do interdisciplinary research on human and automatic speech recognition, this might be beneficial for both fields. So this is also where my research is centered. Now, in the research that I'm talking about today, the crucial question is, what is the optimal representation of speech for a deep neural network-based automatic speech recognizer to be able to map from one language or type of speech to another? So this is how can we find these invariant representations? What do they look like? And how flexible is a deep neural network-based ASR really? So in this talk, I'm going to talk about how do humans adapt. And particularly, I'm going to talk about a phenomenon called perceptual learning in humans. Then I'm going to talk about perceptual learning in deep neural networks. I'm going to explain to you an experiment that we did in which we investigated whether deep neural networks are able to show perceptual learning. Then I'm going to talk about perceptual learning in deep neural networks over time. And then finally, I'm going to take a step back from the perceptual learning part, which is associated with the flexibility of deep neural networks. But in the final part of this talk, I will be talking about the representations of speech in deep neural networks. So how is speech represented inside a DNN? So first I'm going to talk about perceptual learning. So what is perceptual learning? So a common used definition is that perceptual learning are relatively long-lasting changes to an organism's perceptual system that improve its ability to respond to its environment and are caused by this environment. And the crucial parts here are the long-lasting changes in response to the environment. So the system changes something, in our case is related to listening, to hearing, in response to information it has been exposed to in the environment. And I will be talking about a specific type of perceptual learning, which is called lexically-guided perceptual learning. So in the past, I've done quite a bit of research on this phenomenon. So I will be presenting some of my own data in the past, but this was not a concept or not a phenomenon that was found by me. This was originally found by Dennis Norris, James McQueen, and Ann Cutler in 2003. So lexically-guided perceptual learning can be shown using the following paradigm. So imagine you have an ambiguous input. So in my case here, I hope you can see my mouse. There's an ambiguous input that is ambiguous between a natural L and a natural R. And I'm denoting that as an L/R. Now, in the experiment, we have two groups of people. In the first group, these people are being exposed to the ambiguous LR sound in a context where they are expecting a natural L to occur. So for instance, in the case of apple, the Dutch word appel, English is apple. Instead of hearing apple with a normal L, they're hearing apple where the L is replaced by the ambiguous LR sound. And then there's another group of listeners who hear the exact same acoustic token in terms of the ambiguous sound, but now the ambiguous sound is cross-spliced into a word where people are expecting to hear a natural R, like in wekker, alarm clock. So here all the R sounds have been replaced by the ambiguous sound. Then the context that comes before the ambiguous sound is what we call the disambiguating context. So listeners should be able to figure out from the sounds that come before the ambiguous sound what the ambiguous sound is supposed to be, whether it's going to be should be an L or whether it's supposed to be an R. So listeners are being exposed to this kind of sound in the disambiguating context, and this can be, for instance, a lexical decision task, or it can be in a short story, or it can be a counting task. There are different ways of exposing people to this particular sound. Then after the exposure phase, people are being tested on a continuum from a natural L to a natural R with the ambiguous sounds in between. So for instance, when they hear something like male, which is meal, I should say, where the final L has been replaced by an ambiguous, by a version of the ambiguous sound. In Dutch, male and meer are both words. So here, this is an ambiguous word, and depending on how you learn to interpret the ambiguous sound, you will interpret or recognize this word as being either male on the left, flower, or meer on the right, lake. So depending on whether you have been exposed to the LR sound here, you're interpreting it as male, or if you're exposed to the ambiguous sound as R, as in wekker, you're exposing it as meer. So what's happening here is that depending on what disambiguating context you have been exposed to when hearing the ambiguous sounds, you're adjusting your phoneme category boundaries. To show you the results of an experiment that we did, that's the first another one. So how we do this, basically, so I already told you about this. So we have an exposure phase. In this particular experiment, we had a lexical decision task. We had two groups of people. either they heard all the L's replaced by an ambiguous sound, and then they heard natural R words, or vice versa, all natural R's were replaced by the ambiguous sound, and they heard natural L words, and then there were filler words without an L and an R, and non-words without L and R. And then they did a phonetic classification task where they were supposed to indicate whether an ambiguous sound was an L or an R. And this is what you then typically see. So here you see two lines. The R group are the people who were exposed to an ambiguous sound in the R context, which means that they are expecting to hear an R. And the green line are the results for the group of people who were exposed to the ambiguous sound in a context where they were expecting to hear L. And on the left here, you see an ambiguous sound that consists about 20% of R and 80% L. And on the right, you see the reverse. This ambiguous sound consists of about 80% R characteristics and 20% L characteristics. And on the y-axis, you see the proportion of R responses. And what we see here very clearly is first that there's a huge gap between the two lines, meaning that the people who were exposed to the ambiguous sound in an R context gave far more R responses than people who were exposed to the ambiguous sound in an L context. This gap is what we refer to as the lexically-guided perceptual learning effect. So the lexically-guided perceptual learning effect causes a temporary change in phonetic category boundaries, which means that you temporarily include the ambiguous sound as if into your phoneme category as if it were a normal pronunciation of that particular phoneme. But it needs lexical or phonetic knowledge for it in order to occur. Lexically-guided perceptual learning generalizes to words that have not been presented earlier. So words, if you suddenly hear another word that you haven't heard yet, you will again interpret the ambiguous sound in the same way you did earlier during the exposure phase. It is speaker dependent. So if I would have a weird pronunciation, it would not mean, so you would adapt your phonetic categories for my speech, but not for that for someone else immediately. It's fast. You only need about 10 to 15 ambiguous items for this effect to happen. And it's long lasting. We don't know how long lasting, but at least more than a week. So when I was doing this type of research, primarily at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and also the Radboud University Nijmegen, Netherlands, we typically said that people who had participated in this type of experiment were not allowed to participate again for a year and a half after participation in the experiment. It doesn't, the adaptation of the phoneme categories doesn't last that long, but we want to be very, very sure that there was no effect left. Now, so humans are very, very good at adapting the phoneme categories. And this is ideal if you want to build a deep neural network-based ASR system that can change or that can adapt to a new type of speech or a new language. This is exactly what we want. So if you consider that deep neural networks are inspired by the human brain, the question that arose, for me at least, is but can they flexibly adapt to different speech types and different languages like human listeners can? So human listeners can very quickly adapt to a new accent or a speech impediment. Can deep neural networks do the same thing? And if so, can we then visualize the representations of the speech at the hidden layers in the deep neural networks? Because if we can, we might be able to find intermediate representations that have correlates in human perceptual adaptation. So we might be able to also learn more about how humans actually perceive speech. Another way of looking at it, this type of research also tries to open up the black box that are deep neural networks. So how did we do this? Well, first, we trained a baseline deep neural network on Dutch vet speech of about 64 hours of speech. And this is a very standard feed-forward network. Nowadays, we have far more advanced architectures, but this is a feed-forward network with 5 hidden layers. So we had the baseline model, which we can see or treat as a naive Dutch listener. Then we retrained this baseline model using the acoustic stimuli from one of the earlier experiments with humans that I did with my colleague Esther Janssen. So we use the exact same acoustic stimuli. So we really try to mimic the human experiment with our deep neural network setup. In order to do that, we retrain in 3 different ways. Of course, we were treating one of the models as if it was a listener from the ambiguous R group. So as if it was a listener that was exposed to the ambiguous sound in a context where he or she was expecting to hear an R. This is called the ambiguous R group. Then we have the ambiguous L group. So this is a model that you can see as if it was a listener from the group of listeners who was exposed to the ambiguous sound in a context where it was expecting to hear an L. But because we're retraining our models, and we are interested in finding differences between the ambiguous L and the ambiguous R model, but we also want to make sure that if we observe differences, this is not simply because of our retraining, but it's also that we are observing the effect that we are hoping to observe. That's why we also include the baseline model, which was retrained. So this is the second baseline model. So we had the baseline model that was trained on Dutch red speech. Then we retrained the new baseline model with all the same speech data from the original Scharenborg-Janssen study, but without the ambiguous sounds. So where the ambiguous R and ambiguous L groups had or models got some 40 items with an ambiguous sound in it, the new baseline model did not. It only had the natural versions of L, natural versions of R, and all models were trained with the same additional 120 natural words without L and R. Now, what are we expecting to find then if we do that? So if DNNs are able to flexibly adapt to a new pronunciation, what do we expect to find? So for the human listeners, what we observed was if there are that there are more R responses when people are exposed to a context like Wecker, where they're expecting to hear a final R. So they learn to interpret the ambiguous sound as an R. Vice versa, we found that people gave more L responses when they were exposed to the ambiguous sound in a context where they were expecting to hear an L. So they learn to associate interpret the ambiguous sound as an L. For the deep neural network experiments, we are expecting to hear differences. We are expected to see differences, particularly between the ambiguous L and the ambiguous R model. And what these differences are, well, we expect them to be in line with what we're observing for the human listeners. So we looked at the results in 3 different ways. We looked at the retuning results, so the classification results. So what are the decisions made by the deep neural networks? We looked at intersegment distances. So we tried to do some calculations related to the distances in the hidden layers. And we actually visualized the hidden layers and to see what the clusters of L sounds, R sounds, and ambiguous sounds, how they were situated in the deep neural networks. So let's first have a look at the lexical retuning results. So I have to point out here that because we're working with a really tiny set of data, because acoustic experiments with human listeners typically involve a very, very small set of data, acoustic data, we actually have a situation where our test set is the same as a train set, which is of course not done in normal automatic speech recognition research. So this is a disclaimer. But so what happens? So we have our baseline model here. So these are the results, and I'm only going to focus on the recognition results or classification results for the L, the R, and the ambiguous sound. So remember, the baseline model is retrained on the acoustic speech from the experiments, but has not been exposed to the ambiguous sound yet. So what we see is that it has a very high accuracy on the L sound and a very high accuracy on the R sound. On the ambiguous sound, we see that in less than 50% of the cases, it is recognized as an L and hardly ever as an R. So the ambiguous sound is not that well recognized by a baseline. Now, the question is what's going to happen when you give the model a tiny bit of input in terms of the words that contain the ambiguous sound, either in the L context or the R context. What then do we see? So the ambiguous L model. So we first look at the L. So when you retrain the model, unfortunately, it no longer can recognize the natural L. This is something that we have been looking into, but we haven't entirely found an answer yet to why that is. What we do see is that the R, and this is important, the R is still recognized really well. And so this model has been exposed to natural R and the ambiguous LR. Interestingly, the ambiguous sound is now being interpreted as an L most of the time. This is exactly what we were expecting, because the context in which the ambiguous sound has been presented to the model is a context where it should have been expecting an L. We find the reverse results for the R model. The L is still recognized really well. The original natural R is also still recognized fairly well, although we do see a small drop. I'm pointing with on the wrong screen, sorry. So we do see here a small drop in the R, but the ambiguous sound is now interpreted as an R. So the model has learned with a tiny bit of information that if there's ambiguous sound and it occurs in an L context, then it should be interpreted as an L. If it occurs in where it is in an R context or where it is expecting an R, it interprets it as an R. So at the decision level, a deep neural network has made some changes compared to the baseline model where it did not know what to do with the ambiguous sound. This is already good. But the question, of course, is something happening in the hidden layers? And if so, what is this? So we then calculated intersegment distances at each layer. So we had 3 hidden layers. So we calculated intersegment distances at each layer. So what does this mean? So we calculated the Euclidean distance between each ambiguous segment and each L and each R segment. And that was averaged over all ambiguous segment L and ambiguous segment R pairs. So you get an average L ambiguous sound distance and an average R ambiguous sound distance. And what we then observed, to just summarize the results, is that the higher you get in your layer, so the further removed you are from the input layer and the closer you are to your decision layer, we see that the distance between the natural L and the ambiguous sound decreases for the model, the ambiguous L model, so the model that learns to interpret the ambiguous sound as an L. And we find the reverse effect for the ambiguous R model. So the distance between the natural R and ambiguous sound decreases the further you get into the model for the ambiguous R model. So that's the model that learns to interpret the ambiguous sound as an R, which seems to indicate that these models learn to interpret the ambiguous sound as if it is a normal instantiation of the natural L for the ambiguous L model, or normal instantiation of the R or the ambiguous R model. But you wanted to see what that actually looked like. So what we did was we visualized the learned clusters in the hidden layers. And so I'm going to show you 3 of these kind of pictures. And these are PCA visualizations of the 4th hidden layer. So this is the hidden layer right before the decision layer. And this is the baseline model. So it's a 3D projection of a high-dimensional space. And in green, you see the ambiguous sound. In red, you see the L sound. And in R, you see the blue sound. And each dot is basically the activation to the input. So the activation by the deep neural network to the input, either the ambiguous sound, an L, or an R. And what you see here in the baseline model is that the L and R on either side of the ambiguous sound. So the ambiguous sound is very nicely aligned in space, and this is a non-linear space, but it very neatly fits between the 2 groups of sounds. The question is, what's happening when the model learns to reinterpret the ambiguous sound either as an L or as an R? So first, the results for the R. This is what we then see. So again, the red ones are the activations to the responses to the L sound, and the blue are the activations to the R sound, and here the green ones again are the ambiguous sound. What we see is that the green dots are lying very nicely next to the dots for the R. So the ambiguous sound very nicely lies next to the representation of the R, whereas the representation of the L sounds is further removed from the other two. And we find the reverse results for the ambiguous L model. This is a slightly changed view of the space to show the effect the best. Again, we see now that for the ambiguous L model, the ambiguous sound is nicely situated next to the representation of the natural L, whereas the natural R representation is further removed. So to conclude this part, the DNNs trained with ambiguous sounds show perceptual learning. And not only at the output of the decision layer, but also at the intermediate layers. Now, okay, great. But how much information is actually needed? So for perceptual learning for humans need about 10 to 15 of these ambiguous items for the effect to occur. So how about deep neural networks? So we did the exact same experiments, but rather than training the system on all the 40 items that we had, what we did was we created 10 bins of only 4 items each, so 4 ambiguous items each, and then we tested on unseen data from the next bin. So here we have a clearly separated training and test set. So we have bin 1 with 4 items, and then we test it on 4 other items in bin 2. Then we add the 2, so we have 8 items, and then we test on the 4 items in bin 3. Then we add these, so we train on 12 items, etc., all the way to the final bin. And then we end up basically with the model that I just presented and the data that I just presented. So then what we did was we plotted the recognition responses. So we did not do the visualizations and the calculation at the intermediate layer for this. I'm just going to give you the results on the classification experiments. So what we here have on the x-axis is the bin number. So bin 0 means 0 items. Here is bin 1 with 4 items. Bin 2 has 8 items of training material, etc. And then here we see the proportion of R responses on the y-axis. And the crucial part here are the orange lines. So the orange line at the bottom shows the ambiguous sound classified as an L by the model, and the dashed line here, the solid line here, the orange one, shows the ambiguous sound as it was classified as an R. So this is the baseline model that has not been exposed to the ambiguous sound during training. What we see here is that after training on no ambiguous sound, only on the normal sounds, we see an increase in the ambiguous sound being recognized as an R, and that stays stable over time. But it's not being recognized as an L at all. This is just a bias that's already in the system, and we need to figure out why that is and how we can remove that. Crucially are what's happening for the ambiguous L and the ambiguous R models. We pointed this out. Also here first, what I also should point out is that even with a tiny bit of training material, you already see a massive jump in the recognition performance. And the blue one, the green one here is the recognition of R as R, and this one is recognition of natural L as L. Now, this is the model that learns to interpret the ambiguous sound as an R. And here we again see that we start around 50%, and then with only 4 items of 4 ambiguous sounds, we see a massive jump in the recognition performance, and then we see that the ambiguous sound is continuously being recognized as an R at a really high level, whereas it is not being recognized as an L at all, which is exactly what we would like to see, what we are hoping to see. And we've observed a similar effect for the ambiguous L model, but here because there's a bias in the model that interprets the ambiguous sound as ideally as an R sound rather than an L sound. we see that this particular line starts, the orange line starts at a very low performance, but also here, only after 4 items, we see a jump from almost 0% of the ambiguous items being interpreted as an L to almost 60%. So this is a jump of more than 50% with just 4 items. And we see performance growing over time as we add more data confirming or telling the system that the ambiguous sound is an L. So deep neural networks need only a few ambiguous items. Similar to humans, we also only need a few items, and there seems to be a step function. And I did not talk about that regarding the human experiments, but also for humans, we found that there seems to be a step-like function. You do not get it, and suddenly bang, with a tiny bit of additional data, you suddenly switch, and something happens in your brain, and then you are able to treat that ambiguous sound as if it were a normal instantiation of that sound. And DNNs seem to show a similar step-like function. Now, I hope I still have some time because I would like to move on to the final experiment. So far, we're talking about the flexibility of deep neural networks, and I was inspired by the perceptual learning effect that we observe in humans and see whether deep neural networks have a similar type of flexibility. And the answer is yes, they do. The other question that is crucial to building flexible ASR systems is that we need to find speech representations that can transfer easily and accurately to another language or another speech type. So in the piece of research that I would like to share now, we looked at the speech representations inside the deep neural network themselves. So the representation of speech in deep neural networks. And what we were interested in is, so speech is highly variable. So what speech representations are learned by deep neural networks when they are faced with the large variability in speech? And the specific research question that we had was, can a generic DNN-based ASR trained to distinguish high-level speech sounds learn the underlying structures of speech that are used by human listeners when they are trying to understand speech? So if we do not tell the ASR systems much about speech, can it still learn linguistic structures that we use, that we know that are there in speech, and use that to do the speech task that we give it? In other words, to give an example from vision, imagine you have a classifier, it needs to classify chairs versus planes, and we have built a classifier that is well able to do that. So it can distinguish between these two pictures. But the question then is, did it learn to distinguish between the blue background and the green grass? Or, and this is what we are interested in, was it able to extract and learn features that are associated with planes and those that are associated with chairs? So that's the question that we're asking then about speech. And the task, so we trained again a naive, generic, feed-forward deep neural network with 3 hidden layers on the same corpus of spoken Dutch. And then we gave it a very high-level task. And this is a constant vowel classification task. So the system only had to say this is a constant, this is a vowel. So it didn't need to learn anything about linguistic structures in order to do that, in principle. The question is, does it learn any of these linguistic structures? So what we did was we visualized the activations of the speech representations at the hidden layers using different types of linguistic labels. If we would observe clustering based on certain labels, then we know that the system apparently used that information to cluster the speech representations in such a way that it helped the system to classify consonants versus vowels. We used different types of linguistic labels. We used vowels and consonants, of course, because that was the main task, and they differ in the way they are produced. Broadly speaking, there's an absence or presence of a constriction in the vocal tract. There's more to it, but for now, this is enough of a definition. We looked at phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest unit that changes the meaning of a word. For instance, bowl versus wall, where the B and W, the W, change the meaning of the word. So these are phonemes. And we looked at articulatory features. articulatory features are acoustic correlates of the articulatory properties of speech sounds. And we primarily looked at manner of articulation. So we looked at the type of the constriction. For instance, there's a full closure or there's a narrowing. We looked at place of articulation. So where is the location of the constriction? And these two we only looked at for the consonants. And for the vowels, we looked at the tongue position at the vertical plane and on the horizontal plane, looking at where the bunch was of the tongue. So to dive straight into the results. So we first looked at the classification results of the main task, so consonant versus vowel classification. And we had a frame level accuracy of just over 85%. And this is average over 5 training runs. And the level of accuracy is similar for consonants and vowels, 85.2 versus 86.7% for consonants and vowels respectively. So the system did not do amazingly well, but it was pretty okay at doing the task. So we were interested in doing this task. Did it use any of the linguistic structures that we know that exist in speech? So we first were looking at, do we see a change in the activations for consonants and vowels through the hidden layers? So this is what that looks like. So we visualized again the I think this is the 4 different layers. So we did not visualize the output layer because that is just decisions. So we had the vowels in blue, the blue dots, and orange is consonants. And the top left is the original inputs of the network. It might look on your screen that these two are clearly separated, but the blue ones actually have lots of different orange dots in there. As the system learns the vowel classification, the vowel consonant classification task, we see a slow separation of the 2 classes. There's blue here, orange here, more blue here and as the layers increase, so the closer you get to the decision layer, the fewer of the orange dots are mixed with blue and vice versa. And in fact, only there are, I think, about 5 or 6 dots, blue dots here at the top right corner, mixed with the orange dots. So there seems to be a clear separation between vowels and consonants as you progress through the layers. Now, what happens underlyingly? Does it use any linguistic structures? I'm only going to show you the results here for the articulatory feature task because these are the clearest. So here we labeled all the points according to the manner of articulation for consonants on the left, and we looked at, I said the tongue bunch, but I was actually wrong. So here we did 2 ways. This one is we looked at whether there's a difference between diphthong. So Dutch has lots of diphthongs, short vowels and long vowels. So these are 3 different vowel categories because we were expecting to see differences here. Now what we see here for the consonants, we see here on the right bottom, we see an area with lots of blue dots, and we see an area with lots of red dots. Interestingly, the red ones are fricatives and the blue ones are plosives. And as we know, the pronunciation of plosives and fricatives is pretty similar. Plosives have a closure and then there's a release which contains some friction, and fricatives consist only of friction. So the fact that these are on the one hand clearly separated but lying next to each other is very interesting. We never told the model to do this, but it clearly separates out fricatives and plosives from the other types of consonants and puts them together, but at the same time keeps them separated although lying next to each other. The other blob here, which also includes approximants and nasals, also includes some fricatives and plosives, so this one is less clearly separated. But we're seeing that even though we didn't tell the system anything about plosives and fricatives and other types of consonants, it is separating them out. For the vowels, the picture is not that clear. We see some long vowels at the top, at the left, and at the bottom, but mostly the short vowels and diphthongs are sort of spread out all over the place. Then we relabeled them using place of articulation, using 6 different classes for the consonants, and we looked at the horizontal plane of the tongue bunch for the vowels. So we looked at the front vowels, back vowels, and central vowels. the first thing when we look at consonants, what we see is that it looks very pretty, but we don't see clear clusters. So it looks like the system did not use place of articulation as a source of information to cluster speech representations that could be helpful for the vowel consonant classification task. The vowels on the other hand, are much more clearly separated. There's a huge red blob here for front vowels. There are 2 blobs here for the back vowels, and the rest here is central vowels with some front and back vowels in it. So if you summarize these results, the DNNs showed a progressive abstraction in the subsequent hidden layers for the vowel consonant task. And interestingly, it captured the structure, the linguistic structure in speech by clustering the speech signal into linguistic categories without explicit training. We never told the system that there was any structure to it apart from that there were consonants and that there were vowels. So they primarily used manner of articulation for consonants and tongue front backness for vowels as an information source to capture the speech representations. And very similar to human listeners, DNNs can adapt to non-standard speech or idiosyncratic speech on the basis of only a few labeled examples. And they do that already in the hidden layer. So not only the decision layer, but already in the hidden layer, meaning that DNNs, like human listeners, are adapting their speech representations while processing non-standard speech. And DNNs show a step-like function in doing so. So going back to the start of my talk, referring back to our needs, if we want to build a flexible ASR system that can deal with all kinds of speech and all kinds of languages, so we need invariant units of speech which transfer easily and accurately to other languages. Now, these results have shown that deep neural networks have flexible phone categories, very similar to the flexibility that humans have in their phone categories. And that deep neural networks can actually automatically create linguistic categories. Because the last experiment that I showed, we never told the system that there were categories, that there was linguistic structure. At the same time, it did use that information and basically create its own linguistic categories. And a teaser, the paper is currently almost resubmitted after minor revisions. We also found, in a different experiment, we found several of these actually invariant speech units that transfer easily from one language to another language. Then regarding the other need, the ASR system that can flexibly adapt to new types of speech, well, we have shown with these experiments that deep neural networks are able to do that. So the next step is that we need ASR systems that can decide when to create a new sound category and do so. And that is the next step, hopefully, of my research. But this is also the end of this talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Odette, for this very, very interesting talk. And we have one question already in the chat from Sorina. Sorina, do you want to? I can read your question. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, so what are the plausible theories for the ambiguous L model not to recognize the natural L? Could the test set, string set have affected it? Exactly, that's actually what we think. We think that the, well, first of all, the L and the R are sounds that are known to influence the pronunciation of the sounds that come before it. And especially R does that very strongly. So the L and R are not phonemes by themselves, but they have an effect on the pronunciation from everything that comes before it. So if you train the model in one direction with a tiny bit of additional speech, we just think that it might be an overtraining of the baseline system, basically in this case, the ambiguous L system. It's not really what we would like to see, but that's what we think is happening. It's simply an overtraining effect. And yes, that the test set and train set is the same is very likely the reason for that, because that very much allows for overtraining, overfitting. Thank you.
Serena, I don't know if you want to say something. Harit, shall I make Serena? Serena, do you want to say something? Thank you. Okay.
That's clear.
Yes. Okay, so more questions from the public? I am sure.
Yeah,
It's going.
Serena, please go ahead.
Who?
There's one more question from Serena.
Is there a question? I cannot see it.
Yeah, but it only says one more question though, but it doesn't say what the question is. So I'm not sure whether it's still going to come or whether Serena cannot unmute herself.
I don't know.
Could the last experiment hold as an argument against the universal grammar theory? Oh, now I really have to admit that I actually forgot what the universal grammar theory is. I learned that many years ago in university, but I forgot. So if someone can explain the universal grammar theory and especially the question. So Serena, maybe you can give more information about that because I'm really curious.
Serena, you can open your microphone, I think.
Okay, so the human language is innate. This is a really good question. Now I have to really dive into it. So a long time ago, I looked into language acquisition, into the human language acquisition literature, and whether human language is innate. I think there is definitely some innateness to human language because we know that babies are able to distinguish between sounds that are part of human language, but not so well when it's not human language. And yeah, so the fact that the deep neural network is able to find structure in the acoustics does speak for it for language to be innate, but that also means that you are treating the deep neural network as if it were a perfect model of human speech processing. And the deep neural network that I've used definitely is not. So I do want to make that comment there. At the same time, I also think that speech did not just come about, right? There is a reason why we speak the way we speak, why we have the sounds that we have, why we have the sounds that we have, why human languages have evolved the way they did. So yes, there's a lot of dissimilarities between languages. At the same time, there's a lot of similarity between languages. So the fact that there is some structure, I think only makes sense. And I think this structure has probably helped develop the languages that it did. So whether human language is innate, I guess part of it definitely is. At the same time, I would not really go to say that this particular experiment shows that human language is innate. And it just shows that there are regularities in human language. In fact, this is only for Dutch, but I'm pretty sure we'll find the same type of experiment results for other languages as well. So I would just say there's a lot of regularities in human language that a deep neural network can exploit, and that these are very similar to the regularities that we humans exploit while listening to speech. Oh, it was a very long one.
Yes.
Can we humans really create new sound categories, or we just map those new sounds to the sounds that we already know? I mean, after a certain age, 30, 40, it is very difficult for us humans to learn new sounds. Could deep neural networks experiments the same problem that is being too tuned to some particular language, using only a few samples would not be enough to adapt? We would require more data. I'm aware that people are working on these issues right now, but what's your opinion on this? Well, I really love this question because this is actually one of the reasons why I started to work in this particular area. So humans actually, so when we learn a new language, we are actually learning new sound categories. And yes, the older you get, typically, broadly speaking, it is more difficult to learn new language, and particularly learning the new sound categories. But one of my former PhD students, she looked at Dutch listeners of English, and she did a similar experiment as the one that I showed you on perceptual learning. And interestingly enough, even the non-native speakers, so this was Dutch speakers of listeners to English, they also show the exact same perceptual learning effect. And this means that on the one, that non-native listeners do have phoneme categories that are associated or that capture the non-native pronunciation of that particular sound. So they have the non-native phoneme category. That's one. And two, that they also can flexibly adapt this. So that's very similar. So I truly believe that when we are learning a new language, especially when we have a certain level, right? This is not, if you only have a very low level in a non-native language, then this is probably not going to happen. But if you have mastery of another language to a certain level, and I don't know what certain level is here, I have no idea. But you will have created the phoneme categories belonging to that particular language. And often you will find that, yes, it is hard. So for instance, in Dutch, we have the sound and English has a sound. This is my most horrible example because I can't actually pronounce it myself being Dutch, but the contrast. So bad and bed. In Dutch, we do not have that contrast. We only have the sound. So as a Dutch listener, we typically map all the sounds also on That's a very typical response. At the same time, our results have shown that apparently, even though we have difficulty distinguishing these sounds, let alone producing these sounds, for many of these non-native phoneme categories, we have actually separate phoneme categories compared to our native ones. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. There was more to it, but I'm not sure.
Yes, there is another question from Andrea Amelia. What may happen if you extend your target from the single phoneme to a larger segment?
I'd love to know. We haven't been able to do those experiments yet, but if you're interested in doing this, please reach out. And because that's one of the things that I'm really interested in. So these experiments that I've done are direct copies of human experiments and I did these experiments myself, so I had the data. I'm very much interested in seeing what happens when someone is adjusting to an entire regional accent, for instance, or a non-native accent, and how the system changes the speech representations when it is adjusting to another accent. I don't know yet. I don't know, but I would be very much interested in finding out, and I'm pretty sure we will start working on this. We have a lot of research currently happening on disartic speech, for instance, where entire groups of sounds are affected. So we can actually start looking into this question. I hope we will. But thank you very much for this
question. I have one question myself. So in relation to the second part of the second experiment that you have described, in this, I am not sure. You talk about, you have trained this network with many hours, no? So many hours of speech, I understood, no? So and it was many different speakers in this. But only one language, that was only Dutch. So that would be interesting also to see how this compares different languages, or even including many languages, and seeing the real the real categories or manner of articulation of seeing if that could extend more to your final goal.
So we have done these visualization experiments with a model that was trained on English and then later retrained on Dutch, or trained on English and Dutch at the same time. And then we looked at what do the phoneme clusters look like, or actually the manner of articulation, place articulation cluster, what do they look like? And you see that depending on how you train a system, you get more clearly defined or less clearly defined clusters of the sounds. So I can't remember which direction it went eventually, which type of architecture was the better architecture, but we have looked into that, and I think it would be really interesting to do that in a more systematic way. I fully agree. Yeah.
Also, I was wondering about because you are representing what, the one frame, so many frames, or your representation, each point corresponds to one frame. So there are probably many frames that are like a transition from one point manner of articulation to the other one, or vowels that are very much in the transitions. No? So yes.
So
well, I was wondering about that. How do you manage this?
So I think, if I remember correctly, we just used a forced alignment and then just cut out all the ones that were labeled with L or R and replaced it. So, but I'm no, that's not true. We did not use a forced alignment. We actually did this by hand because there are only a few items. For all our acoustic stimuli, we by hand cut up cut out the L and the R and labeled them as L and R ambiguous.
Well, yes, but I was talking about the second part of the talk. So you have a lot of data there. No, so it's probably automatically aligned, and it's probably forced alignment.
Exactly, and that will definitely have caused.
There are probably also many errors in these mix areas where you got your fricatives mixed with something else.
Absolutely. It will definitely have added some noise to the results. Absolutely, yes. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, well, very interesting. So I don't know if there are many more questions from the public. No? I am not sure I am seeing the chat updated.
I am seeing that I have the chat open, but there are no more questions in the chat.
No more questions. Okay, if there are no more questions, we are going to end this very nice talk because it's already past 4. So thank you again very much, Odette, for your very interesting talk. I am very happy that you accepted our invitation.
I'm very happy that you invited me. Thank you very much, and I hope to meet you in person at some point. That would be really nice.
Oh, yes. Yes, in the next conference.
Exactly. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.